Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then, as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on that work, as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American Purpose with my guest, Blair Imani, educator, historian, and influencer. And I can vouch for influencer because we've had some experience together.
Indeed. And I just must say that Interfaith Alliance was my first ever speaking engagement, and it really brought me to an entirely new level in my work where, you want to believe that you have things to say that are worthwhile, but when another such prominent organization that is so aligned in the work that I've been doing also affirms that, it's really just not only an honor, but really just kind of changed my trajectory where I was like, okay, maybe I can do this full time.
That's great. You spoke to a group of our leadership from around the country, and universally they had praise for everything that you said and what you led them through. So thanks for doing that. And I'm glad to be able to exploit it on the other side here by claiming some of your time. So I'm going to start with our basic question, where we start with each of our guests. In your opinion, what was the original purpose of the United States?
The original purpose of the United States, narratively, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and such. But as a historian, particularly of Black history, that is a dubious one. I think that it's a consistent ambition that we have, but it's a lot of duplicity. On the one hand, all men are created equal, but my ancestors were not considered men or human beings. We were considered chattel. And we are simultaneously built on the pursuit of freedom, but also on genocide and harm. And so I think that it's looking at the original purpose in context, very narrowly benefits most people at the time. And that continues today. But I think that it benefits us to look at these ideas as goals, as ambitions that we can live up to as a people should we pursue it, but also by recognizing that the original goals excluded so many. It's kind of a both and, where we have to look at the historical context, put that under consideration, but then expand it beyond and say, okay, well, these are lofty ideas. This American endeavor is worth pursuing, is worth healing from, is worth renegotiating and understanding in a broader way, and then moving forward accordingly. Because, America is a beautiful country where so many possibilities are within reach, and for so many it's not within reach, but we still have the means to shift that, to make it within reach for more people, and that's what really makes us unique, I believe. There are so many other countries where the status quo prevents forward progress, but even our status quo allows for forward progress. That's the difference here. I think it's an ever-changing landscape of possibility.
From your historian's point of view, do you think our founders recognized the inconsistency of their words and their deeds?
Yes. Look at Thomas Jefferson, the way that he wrote about Native Americans, the way that he wrote about Black people, the way that he wrote about enslavement, calling, if I recall correctly, enslavement a racial breeding program, not in those words precisely, but certainly he was aware that there was a bit of duplicity. Calling someone free, writing about freedom while also holding others in captivity is a constant cognitive dissonance that our founders were going through. Human beings are not equipped to systematically dehumanize other people. And that proves true throughout history. It's kind of this constant guilt. But then also the ways that he praised Native American leaders was simultaneously in kind of a white supremacist framework. So they were certainly aware. What frustrates me is that we infantilize them almost, and we say, oh, well, we have to understand them in a different way. No, they kind of knew that they were doing egregious things, and they wrote about it amongst themselves. And I think that it is necessary to look at all figures throughout history as multidimensional figures, because it's far more interesting that way, but it also allows us to be less precious about the things that they created that are problematic.
Sort of makes you wish that the phrase cognitive dissonance existed back then, just so it could be said in their presence. What do you think ought to be or is the American purpose going forward?
I think going forward, we need a far better historical memory in order to really evaluate the things that have gone awry and not on accident, on purpose, and really consider it in totality. America is a great experiment. We have done a lot of harms as a people, as a country, as a system, and if we erase that, how can we look at the harms? How can you go to the doctor and find the cause of your illness if you're only looking, at the symptoms, not at a root cause? You'll just be treating the symptoms and you'll be withering away simultaneously. And I think that because of the current moment, there is such a need for instant gratification. So do away with everything, rebuild it. But that's not really what America has been for, and that's not what other, great societies have been about. It's been about really healing from it, moving forward, doing so in a far more radical way, and looking at so America was so experimental when we began. Why not continue to be experimental and to adapt for the times and do bold and innovative things like completely shifting the structure of the cabinet, completely shifting the structure of voting, getting rid of the electoral college? Because that's what America essentially did when we hopped onto the scene in the 1700s. We were looking at previous empires and going, we can do better than this. We can innovate beyond this. And yet, 50 years on, we were looking at that initial 1700s and going, oh, we can't innovate past that. America is a place of innovation. I think that is our purpose. I think it is to innovate, to do great things, but to not lose sight of the human rights atrocities that have been happening under the name of America, and to innovate in the ways that we move toward progress as well, which has been done effectively. I mean, I was just writing about how there's Black History Month in the UK and how Akayaba Adai-Sebo, a Ghanaian activist, came to the States and saw the work being done to establish Black History Month in the States, and then started that campaign in the UK. That's just one example of how we've been so influential. Not to say that we have, unique dispositions to do things, but just the ability to kind of think freely, to move freely, and to innovate freely is something that makes America truly unique.
There's been so much conversation about the greatness of America in times past, particularly in the last 4 years. What you raise makes it clear that what has been talked about was the result of innovation, not the legacy of innovation. And it's quite a perspective. Thank you for that, Blair. And speaking of what came before, our society rests on foundational values. Some of them are admirable, and some of them not so much. Can you talk about one or two values that are worth doubling down on, even in our time?
I think transparency. I think that one of the great things that America holds true, but doesn't always do the best, is transparency. Being able to kind of have oversight into the interworkings of governance, and that being able to be carried out by people who do not come from a specific social class. Now, it ultimately comes down to whiteness and wealth, but the way that our systems are written is to allow for more than that. It's just about reinforcing and doubling down on those promises. Another value, I think, is protections within the law, the idea that nobody is above the law. Again, in practice, does that always happen? No, but that's a matter of corruption, not necessarily a matter of the ideals that underlie this work. And I'll add a third one, too. I think that there's just the ability for change, amendments, changing the existing infrastructure. A lot of the mechanisms exist and they are workable, but it is recognizing simultaneously that a lot of what has gone wrong hasn't gone wrong just because, we forgot to include Black people in the GI Bill. It's because folks like Oscar DePriest were pushing for that. And yet, in the Civilian Conservation Corps, there was an adamance to limit enrollment to 10% Black people, and that ultimately ended up being 8% Black people when Black unemployment was double white unemployment because of the legacy of slavery, which was not that long ago at the time. And so when we look today and we go, oh, the New Deal was one of the best pieces of legislation, it's saying, and it needed an anti-racism lens. So not being so precious about the things that we've done well and being able to criticize those things the way that we look at other countries and criticize them. I think that we have a great, lofty moral, we want to always be in the moral high ground in the States, but we sometimes fail to look inward. But that's not something that's irreconcilable.
So how about a couple of values that we need to get rid of? What are some of the things that are holding us back from necessary progress?
Oh.
I've been teeing you up for this one all along.
Oh, yes. 1 second. Let me just switch. I'm trying to... Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. I think that there's a few. One, like I said before, historical memory. When I went to Berlin on a Black Lives Matter delegation journey, I saw the legacy of remembrance that they have in Germany, not forgetting the atrocities of the past, but really holding them up, keeping things like the graffiti that was created by the Soviet army when they liberated Germany in the Bundestag, in the Capitol building, so that as you walk through the halls, you're not forgetting the ways that fascism rose, the ways that anti-Semitism rose and were codified. And I think in the United States, we're amazing at creating propaganda. We're amazing at creating media, and it's often to the detriment of our own people. So we'll look at World War II, for example, and point our fingers at the rest of the world while not looking inward and saying, we didn't accept survivors and refugees who later became subjected to the atrocities of the Holocaust. We incarcerated Japanese people. We incarcerated Italians. We were lynching Black people at this time while simultaneously pointing around the world and saying, this is bad, this is bad, this is bad, not how are we doing a horrible thing as well? How are we stoking the flames of white supremacy, which includes anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism? And so it's that step. A historical lens, a historical memory, a culture of remembrance, not of instant forgetfulness and stumbling, headfirst into repetition. That is one. Another is a misinterpretation of free speech versus protected speech. That is a ongoing issue where people feel as though they are divinely enabled to say the most harmful things under the guise of free speech. I think we would do well to have a little bit of Ubuntu in the United States, the ancient African philosophy of I am because you are, and humanity towards others, which would solve things like people refusing to adhere to a mask mandate. Oh, it's my personal freedoms. Yes, but if we could better recognize that your personal freedoms are interconnected to the freedoms and lives of other people, I think that would do very well. And I think that it has to do a bit with the so many things in the U.S. feel temporary because it is rather new. Looking at Germany, you can go to museums and see things from, the ancients, and it's not even in glass cases because they have so much old stuff. And here we'll look at a building and be like, wow, that's 50 years old. So ancient. And so I think those things, and I could really I'm a historian, so I have to lean hard on the historical legacy. Harriet Tubman passed in 1913. Dr. King and Anne Frank were the same age. These are things that need to be pronounced. And there's a lot of that. Another thing is that we preoccupy ourselves with the work of very few white individuals, where we'll spend time in history classes looking at an exchange that Ben Franklin had with a mistress in France, instead of maybe spending equal time on a far larger issue of what enslaved people or what Native Americans were dealing with in terms of being displaced, but also with the Cherokee Federation, with the Iroquois Federation, and things like this. So white supremacy, coming down to that, understanding that it is not a bad thing to name the things that we have wrong, because it is far less comfortable to name and learn from those things than it is to directly experience them. But what's beautiful is that folks like me, I'm, 27 years old. I don't have a doctorate. I'm able to speak freely about these things and use my talents to make connections and kind of go beyond what society has dictated is my ceiling and speak about things like the Great Migration. That's something that we really need to lean into. And I think what's necessary to get there is when we look at class, we have to understand that race is wrapped up in it. When enslavement is happening in the U.S. In the 1600s to the 1700s to the 1800s, it is a class issue. Black people were classed as cattle, essentially, chattel slavery, and as property, and racialized as Black simultaneously. So when I hear people say things like, well, the race issue is interesting, but what we really need to look at is poverty. Why is it an either or? We can do multiple things at once. And so it's getting comfortable with that nuance, getting comfortable with the messiness that is America, and not feeling as though we have to throw things away, but being less precious about the things that are horrible, that are, vile, and just reprehensible, owning up to it and not feeling as though we need to protect the things that have consistently not worked.
So it's ironic that in addition to this backward glance that I mentioned before, and your emphasis on the importance of accurate remembrance and acknowledgement of what it is, part of what the culture of America is, and President Kennedy was the one who really articulated it for my generation, was looking forward to the new frontier. Don't worry about what's over your shoulder. It's what's new and exciting and coming along that we want to be focused on. And that leaves a lot of pain, injury, and important knowledge in the past.
And it's interesting because I do love Kennedy. I have one of his speeches in book form, and I think that it's looking at those things, but also acknowledging that Kennedy came from a very privileged background, and it didn't serve him well to necessarily look at why that privileged background existed. Not the best, business practices that certainly served them well as having a long legacy. But, I understand not wanting to look at the past. But even as we make sci-fi, which I think is one of the beautiful things that also came out of that generation was, the moving paper fantasies, like stories of, Star Wars and Star Trek and all these different things, of which that Dr. King was a fan of Star Trek. It's understanding that even those things carry white supremacy in them. Why is it the case that everybody in outer space has a British accent? That looks like imperialism to me. That looks like a little bit of white supremacy to me, And of course, it's because I'm looking at it in that lens. But also understanding that we are limited sometimes by our own imagination, not by the possibilities that exist within the universe. And if we look at what has gone wrong in the past, then we can evaluate, well, why are we so preoccupied with looking into the new frontier? Is it because of course it's the Cold War, but also looking at how the Stonewall riots happened right at the same time America was getting ready to go into outer space. And you have folks like Gil Scott-Heron who are writing poetry called Whitey on the Moon about how a rat bit his sister and she's sick and he can't pay for and it's far more poetic than I'm giving it justice, but how his sister is sick and got bitten by a rat and she lives in an infested apartment and white people are going to the moon. What does that mean? What does that do for disillusionment and for radicalization for people who feel as though, why bother with this American experiment if they're not even concerned with me? What does it mean for me to go to the moon? What does it mean to have disability justice when the framework of going to the moon is something that requires so much on physical exertion, when how accessible is even the Space Center itself? And so it's looking at these things in a holistic way. And what I always encourage people to do is look at, why are we looking toward the next thing? Is it because there's unresolved things in the past? And it's kind of like how people speak about ghosts not being able to leave this earthly realm unless they reconcile everything. I feel that we should do the same when it comes to innovation. Can we go on to the next chapter when there are so many people who are being left out, who are in that last page, not because they're just not clever enough or just not strong enough or, charismatic enough, but because they are literally being fenced in, caged in, and beaten down every time they try to remedy their conditions.
So we've been talking a lot about the collective society. Let me narrow the focus a little bit. Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality. But the first freedom in the Bill of Rights is very personal. It is freedom of religion. It's freedom of conscience. What values that are rooted in your personal belief system do you commend to those who don't share your beliefs?
I'm Muslim. I'm also Black Muslim, Pan-Africanist. I try to be very internationalist and just really thinking about very expansively, like, am I putting my beliefs in an ancient text without an analysis for the state of humanity and the things that have shifted since it's been written. I'm also a historian, so I always look at those lessons from these ancient texts in context, in historical context, which gives a lot better lens, in my opinion. But I don't believe that everyone needs to believe in God. I don't believe that everyone needs to pray the same as me. I don't believe that it's necessary to judge one another. And I do believe that those values are within Islam. But I also very much understand that Muslims are imperfect. Islam is perfect. Allah is perfect. And it's a constant aspiration to get to that place while also understanding that we have our own motivations and biases and misinterpretations and motivations to control people, to use whatever means necessary, not only for liberation, but oftentimes for oppression. And I think that's what I think is applicable broadly, just understanding that humanity applies these religious doctrine, and it is not always in pursuit or in service of a divine figure, but in the idols of humanity and the greed of humanity. So that's something that I really carry throughout. But for me, Islam has been a place where, I grew up Christian, and I converted to Islam in 2015, and it was kind of a lifelong interest in Islam, where following 9/11, my friend, his mother came in and talked to us about Islam, and it just sounded so beautiful to me. And simultaneously, I'm seeing on the news how it's being maligned, and it gave me a great interest to look at what is this hidden thing that I have been made to be afraid of. And I think that that's also kind of where my interest comes in as a historian, is why are these things being hidden away? Why aren't they being discussed? But as a spiritual person, it has been a respite from the pains of society, the struggles, the work toward liberation, just being able to commune directly with a higher power and surrender to that, and for a moment not be preoccupied with the physical realm. Really looking like Kennedy talked about, this, forward future, but also knowing that I have to prepare myself to get there.
Very nice. Thank you. Blair, how should our society pursue our national purpose? What should we be doing?
I think we need to do internal work. So there's a book. It's hilarious. It's called, I'm trying to look for it on my bookshelf. It's called Colorblind by Margaret Halsey. A White Woman Looks at the Negro. And I bought this book at a thrift store because I thought it was hilarious that it existed. And so I went to the checkout counter, and they were so embarrassed they had it in stock. They gave it to me for free, which is the best price. And I was just going to read it kind of as a joke. And I was reading it in preparation for my book, which I've just finished, but I'm a great procrastinator. So I was like, well, I'll just do this research. And it's like, what am I going to get a value from this? And sometimes the most interesting endeavors are those that you have no motivations going into, or you kind of just look into because you're like, oh, I'll have nothing to benefit from this, whatever. But Margaret Halsey was saying the same things that many people were saying in June 2020 as it related to doing anti-racism work. She was saying, and of course she used different terminology then, bring in a Negro speaker. Bring in some Negro students to your school, but not too many, which she also said. Donate to the NAACP, to the National Urban League, to the ACLU. And I'm looking at these lists and these call to actions, and people are saying nearly the same thing. Hire Black speakers, integrate your schools, of course the unspoken bit of don't do too much, and donate money. But what's lacking in her text, and what I think is lacking today, but is shifting as people are starting to better align this work, is and innovate upon the work, is looking inward. Not just saying, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, but not only just, accepting the fact that your neighborhood is predominantly white, but understanding it's because of redlining, that it's because of racist practices, not just because there's a natural separation between Black people and white people, but because that's been codified in the law. And did I move here because I'm comfortable with that? Did my parents move here because they were comfortable with that? And really owning up to this legacy, which is ugly work to do. That is the unsavory work to do. It is much nicer and it looks much prettier to be able to go out and say, well, that's a problem, that's a problem, that's a problem, and then have situations on at home. And I think that's why a lot of missionary work that is done by different religious groups here in the States is externalized, because it's a lot more detached to build a well somewhere far away overseas and not look at the implementation of that than it is to look at Flint, Michigan and see how water is being denied our fellow Americans. And so it's looking inward, not only inward within our own country, but within our own hearts, within our own homes. And my journey to sobriety has really helped me with that. Becoming sober is such internal work, and one of my barriers to being sober was looking at other alcoholics. And I use the term alcohol use disorder because alcoholic is actually like a super problematic, fraught history, but people generally understand that more popularly. But as I was doing that work, I was looking at other individuals in my life with alcohol use disorders and saying, well, I'm not them, so I clearly don't have a problem, while I'm also causing myself to suffer. And I think it's a good analogy for what is happening in the hearts and minds of a lot of people. We see things like the insurrection on January 6th and we say, oh, that is the worst of it. But simultaneously, not acknowledging the role of anti-Semitism in white supremacy, not fully looking at anti-Blackness within various communities, not extending the anti-racism work that needs to be done beyond just a binary of black and white. And it's harder work, but it is necessary work. And I think that if we are able to do that, we'll get free a lot quicker. Of course, we live in societies that keep us scarce. I really believe that one of the reasons why June 2020 was such a transformative time was because people had a little bit of unemployment benefit. We couldn't go anywhere, but we also were not so secure, but slightly more secure than we had previously been about our own individual states, that we could look outward and inward and say, how is this happening right now? I can't escape it. I can't distract myself from it. I have to deal with it. And that's why it was such a national reckoning. And it is that's going to have to change. Just
for clarity, June 2020, because I know people will be watching this many years into the future, was the emergence of widespread protests and demonstrations in the aftermath of a lot of attention being focused on racism in the police department and Black Americans who suffered at the hands of police.
Yes, and I think that it was this week where I think it was Memorial Day, if I recall correctly, and there was a bird watcher scenario where two Americans, yes, in Central Park, where two Americans with the same last name, different backgrounds, one white, one black, had a viral moment where police were called, threats were made, racism was used as a weapon to cause a black person to conform to a white person's demands. And at the end of that week, we all saw a video of a man named George Floyd having his life extinguished for 8 minutes in just such a brutal way that was so simple, in a way that everyone just wanted to push that officer off of his neck, but couldn't, and was immobilized. And the hurt and the pandemic with such high unemployment, forcing people to sit with it because we literally could not distract ourselves from it,
right, caused
an increased attention. And I think that it's frustrating because on the one hand, I've seen people many times over, about every 6 to 8 weeks, realize the new depths of racism. But what's going to change, and what's going to change from that book from 1946, Colorblind, and what's going to change today is people taking a step inward and saying, how am I contributing to this?
So at this point, I would have asked you what we need to do individually to move the national purpose forward, but you've done a great job of integrating what we need to do collectively and the work that we need to do individually. So I'm just going to go straight to my last question, which is, are you optimistic about America's future?
Oh, always. I'm a chronic optimist, I call myself. I think that being pessimistic, not necessarily pessimistic, but being realistic. And what really excites me is that our our imaginations are sometimes the limitations of not the possibility, but what we decide is possible. And I would say in the past that things aren't going to change overnight, but there's a precinct in Minneapolis that doesn't exist, that existed one day and then no longer existed the next day, because people power dictated that this was unacceptable and that this couldn't exist anymore in the way that it was. Seeing people just take matters into their own hands, not as individual people always, but as collectives. It's a both and, you know, I am because you are, and I'm going to express humanity towards others, even people who I vehemently disagree with. I will not even dehumanize them because that is unacceptable. But I'm always optimistic about the United States because what else is there? And my friend Mariam Kaba said hope is a discipline. And it is, you know, it is something that you can't really get to with pluck and charisma alone. You really have to look at, okay, well, what am I concerned about? How can I manage those concerns? How can I better those concerns? What is in my control? What is in God's hands? And what is God calling on me to do to put it in my hands simultaneously? And I think there's so much that can be improved that excites me. And as an educator, I think that there's a lot of things that people are just not educated on intentionally. And so I think that until we're at a state where everyone is simultaneously informed about the state of things, the historical legacy of America, the historical legacy of things like class and race, and we're in a state of apathy, then I'll start to despair. But we're not even close to getting there. So what I'm focused on is helping folks get to a common understanding, what I call getting smarter, so that we can all get smarter about the state of the world and then regroup, as I call it, regroup and redress the issues that have caused us to be in our current conditions.
Well, I have a lot of unpacking to do of everything you've said, Blair. It's been a breathtaking conversation with you, and I thank you for being with us. And thanks too to our listeners for engaging with us in exploring the American purpose. It's been our honor and pleasure to spend this time with Blair Imani, who has shared her perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes of American Purpose at americanpurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and at interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.